Okay, so in this video, I'm going to put forth my best effort to show you how the federal government has practically no jurisdiction or authority or power off the federal lands. Okay, and what they do have is very, very limited to such things as use of the roads for traveling in between. That means they have no right to tax, to duties, to impost, excise, to commerce, or any other thing off the federal lands. All right, so the first thing I want to do is explain how Congress makes laws. And when you go to congress.gov and they propose a law or pass a law, they have to give their constitutional authority. Okay? Their constitutional authority is somewhere here, and then they show it down here. So this one for H.R. 1 for the People Act of 2021 applies on the federal lands. And I'll show you. They use Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. And I'm going to go through Article 1, Section 8 over the entire thing to show you how this law actually applies on federal land, and that's according to the Constitution. Okay. So I've made up this little paper here, and this is an exact copy of the words in Article 1, Section 8. And here's Clause 1, 2, 3, and then I've added some notes so that you can see what I'm telling you, see how it stands out. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is go to Article 1, Section 1, where it says Congress has the power to make the laws of the United States. And we have to understand that the United States are the combined federal lands. Okay, and you can find that in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, where it says the United States is the seat of government, and they have authority over the places purchased. So you have the United States of America, and then you have the United States. Okay, so we go to Article 1, Section 8, and then the entire section, I want to point out a couple things. First, that this is one sentence long. Being one sentence long, it cannot be taken out of context. That means every single thing is dependent on every other single thing written in this. And I'm pointing to you the semicolons here. These are all semicolons until you get to the very last, and then there's a period after clause 18. So none of this can be picked apart. None of it can be picked apart. It's all one thing. So when it says Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, it's giving you the specific point. Okay, Clause 1. However, it's still all one box. All this is boxed in. It can't be taken apart. And the reason why they did that back then was because it could be taken apart. So like, for example, the Magna Carta, they didn't want it picked apart, so they made it one sentence long. That entire document, the whole Magna Carta, the original one, is one sentence long. That way you could see that it all went together. It couldn't be taken apart. And Article 1, Section 8 cannot be taken apart. It's one sentence long. Okay, that's important to know because the overarching idea of this section is what the government can do, what the federal government can do on the federal lands established by Clause 17, and who can make the laws to do these things, which is Congress. And the Congress, as we see in Article 1, Section 1, has lawmaking authority over the United States. So where are the United States? These are the federal lands. We can look to a jurisdiction report put out in 1956 and 1957. So jurisdiction defined as power and authority. And when jurisdiction has a capital J, it has a capital P and a capital A as part of its definition, which means that it's specific and well-defined, which the Constitution is specific and well-defined. It's only applies to itself. It doesn't apply to anything outside of itself. Federal areas, jurisdiction, power, and authority over the federal areas within the state. Now, this report was put out by the federal government, printed by the Federal Printing Office. Okay. This was a committee put together by Eisenhower in 1953, and they published Part 1 in 1956 and Part 2 in 1957. And the federal areas are called the United States, but they also call them a variety of other things, such as areas, lands, military posts, military reservations, islands, enclaves, and a lot of other things. So Congress has the power to do these things, and it's a list, on these lands for defense with a C. These words are all indicative of being for defense. Okay? The defense of the entire country, United States of America. Okay? So it says, what can they do to collect duties, taxes, duties, impost, and excise to pay the debts and provide common defense and general welfare of the United States, the federal lands. Duties, impost, and excise shall be uniform. And that's because each of the states were different. So the taxes would be different because the federal government that had posts inside the federal areas, not all the posts did the same things. So all those federal areas inside the state had different, some of them had different purposes. And some of them had different ranking officers. And those officers were the ones that are supposed to be taxed. Okay, their income was supposed to be taxed. Okay. Now, how do we know that? Because in 1939, their code says that. And also in Title 4, Chapter 4, it talks about that. Now, this is a positive law, meaning it conforms to the ideas of federalism mentioned in Presidential Document 13132 on federalism, which is Section 1G. Acts of the national government, whether legislative, executive, or judicial in nature, that exceed the enumerated powers of that government under the Constitution, violate the principle of federalism established by the framers. So acts that exceed the powers in the Constitution violate the principles of federalism. And I checked on this a couple months ago, and it had not been repealed. So this is still good law. Now it's called an order because it's applies to the federal government. Okay, so president by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America. So the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America. These two aren't the same. They're different. They're different places. And the taxes were supposed to be on the federal employees. And that was the income tax. This is positive law, which means it complies with the Constitution. It complies with the ideas of federalism. It's not beyond the ideas of federalism, and it applies to the members. The members are the federal employees on the federal lands. Okay, and I can show you where it says that in the document put out by the federal government on the federal areas, the jurisdiction over the federal areas in the states. In chapter 1, in the first paragraph, I believe. Okay, so this is telling you, you can stop the video if you want and read it. You can find the books online. What it's telling you is that originally the people that worked for the government lived and worked on the federal land. They were residents of the federal lands. Being residents of the federal lands, originally they were not state citizens. They were only federal citizens called citizens of the United States or United States citizens. In the Constitution, the members of Congress are required to be citizens of the United States. The president is supposed to be a citizen of the United States. The judicial members are not required to be citizens of the United States. They're not required to live and work on the federal lands. They're not required to be federal citizens. But these people on the federal lands did not have some things that are necessary to us as a civil society. And those things necessary are schools for children, hospitals, insane asylums, fire departments, grocery stores. Even though now on military posts they have grocery stores called the exchanges or the PX or the NEX. So some of these people on these federal lands wanted to come off the federal lands and use the services in the state, but they were not state taxpayers because they were not state citizens. So they sued in a local court and they lost, these federal citizens. They sued in a local court and they lost. They sued in the state Supreme Court and lost. You can't win because you don't pay taxes. So then they added the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which in my opinion actually violates the Constitution. But the 14th Amendment allowed for federal citizens to also be state citizens, so they could be taxpayers at both the federal level and the state level. Because originally the federal citizens were the taxpayers. And if you go to OLRC, Google OLRC, you'll come to a page, internet page where you can see all the titles. So you'll come to here, and then you can click on any of these ones with the asterisks. Means that it applies only to the people on the federal lands. They're called positive laws. Okay, they're all here. Taxation affecting federal areas, sales or use tax. Same, income tax, because income tax applies to the people on the federal lands. And remember, I told you, they quote in their laws the constitutional requirement or the constitutional authority. Where do they get their authority to make this law? And they show you. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. But what does that say? Their laws have to comply. Their positive laws have to comply with the Constitution. And when they don't, they're not positive law, meaning they don't have an asterisk, and they're voluntary. These with the asterisk are positive law, and they're requirements. They're part of the oath. Ones without, they're not, they're voluntary. They're not constitutional, and no one is bound to follow a law that's not an actual law. It's not constitutional. So eventually, these people on the federal lands were able to obtain citizenship in the state and the federal lands. So then they could live off the federal lands, and they could go off the federal lands to use the services because they're now taxpayers in the state. And that's what Title IV under states talks about. And that's what the 14th Amendment talks about, being citizens of both. Okay, so when we go down to, I think 106, there's a link. And the link brings us to here, to Public Law 61 Stat 644. And it talks about the states taxing the federal government for the use of its resources. It talks about sales or use tax, state and so forth, taxation affecting federal areas. No person shall be relieved from liability for payment of collection. When it says no person, it's not talking about people not part of the federal government. It's talking only about people of the federal government, because that's all the Constitution allows. The Constitution is what they call a four corners document. That means it applies only to the people that have an oath, its members. You have to have an oath to have a Bill of Rights. Okay, to have a constitutional right is for people with oaths. People without an oath off federal lands have all their rights, all of them that are mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, those natural rights. Okay, so income tax. No person shall be relieved from liability for any income tax levied by any state or by any duly constituting taxing authority therein having jurisdiction to levy such a tax by reason of his residing within a federal area. So again, it's talking about people who are federal citizens who want to use state services. Those people that are federal citizens, called citizens of the United States, who want to use state services, must also pay a state tax, even if he's living on federal lands. Okay, 14th Amendment. This is explaining what the 14th Amendment means. Okay. And if you read this book, it explains all that to you. And this is chapter 1 of that book, where I just explained to you about estates, the federal citizen also wanting to be a citizen of the state. So a federal citizen who pays state taxes or federal taxes could also pay state taxes, but in turn, they were able to become citizens of the state and pay a state tax. But they're subject to the jurisdiction. So they're subject to federal taxes and they're subject to state taxes. But how did they do this? Because it's not in the Constitution. They had to create another state. And those states are by way of contract. And it's mentioned in the congressional records. Let's see if I can find a better copy. Okay, so this is from 1867 in the Congressional Globe on page 1565. I don't remember for sure if it's the first session or the second session, but this is Mr. Cowan speaking. And I want to read to you some of what he says, just in case it's hard to see, which it probably is. But Mr. Cowan says, "Why, Mr. President, what is a legal state government? Is it a government cooked up for a state here in Congress, or is it a government that the people of the state make for themselves? I like a plain answer to a plain question. Who made these state governments? The state government of Louisiana was made by the people of Louisiana under a proclamation issued by Lincoln, referring that question to them. The question then arose between Mr. Lincoln and the senator from Massachusetts and others of his school, which means his line of thought, as to whom this question should be referenced to as people, or in other words, who are the people? Radical gentlemen said the people are all persons, blacks and whites all together. Mr. Lincoln, however, on consulting his lawyers, was informed that the word people had two significations. That in its general and ordinary signification, it did mean everybody, whites and blacks. But that in its technical or political meaning, it meant the people of a state who were entrusted with the political power of the state. And by what law? By the law of the state. Now, I want to take out the black and white thing, the black people and white people, because I really think that's kind of a red herring in all of this. It's something that sort of takes away from the actual real issue. And the actual real issue is whether the people of the state create a lawful, true state, a real state, then those real states that created the federal government, or are the people the states created by the federal government, such as those federal areas inside the state, or those jurisdictions inside the state. Okay, because a state can also be a subject matter jurisdiction. Okay, so the jurisdiction over federal areas within the state. So the federal areas, if they are also states, it's jurisdiction over states within the states, which is unconstitutional because the Constitution says you cannot have a state within a state. That's why they don't call them states, but they kind of do. And who are the people? The people are not all of us, because all of us did not create the contracts between the federal government and the state for providing services to the federal citizens. And according to Upshur, the people who created the lawful states did not then create the federal government. So this is a book, A Brief Inquiry into the True Nature and Character of Our Federal Government, being a review of Judge Story's commentaries on the Constitution of the United States by Abel P. Upshur, and he did this in 1863, where he goes through Chief Justice Story's commentaries and he picks them apart and explains how his views are not in line with the Constitution and what the Constitution really means, what it really says. And so this is another good, very good resource to have if you're looking at understanding things. So in point 33, he says, Congress had no power to coerce those governments, meaning the contracts between the actual state created by the people and the federal government. It had no right to bring all the people in under those contracts, making us all federal citizens, because we're not all on the federal lands. Only federal citizens on federal lands can be federal citizens and state citizens, and the federal government is the United States. And so it had no power to do that, and if it had no power to do that, we are not that. And since we are not that, it cannot exercise any direct authority over their individual citizens, meaning the citizens of the states. It can only do it when they are also federal citizens. That's the people that it has direct authority over. But we go into the hospital and they say you have to get a birth certificate. Of course they say you have to, because they're a bunch of liars, and that's the only way, or one of the ways, that they can get you under their authority and make you believe you're a taxpayer and you're a person who's required to have a license. And it says that also in their laws, but their laws are written in such a way that make it difficult to understand. Such as when they say things, let's see, like, no person shall be relieved from liability for any income tax levied by any state. So immediately you're thinking, well, then that's all people have to pay taxes. But then it says, having jurisdiction to levy such a tax by reason of his residing within a federal area. And the federal areas, according to the Constitution, are the lands purchased. Okay, so now we know who those people are. Those people that the Constitution has authority over are federal citizens who may also be state citizens. And the federal areas are the United States, and the United States created more states inside the states to supply essential services to the federal citizens who by the 14th Amendment are also state citizens. Okay, so to borrow money on the credit of the United States, of the federal government. So we're not part of the federal government. We don't owe any debt. We're not liable for it. Okay? To regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So to regulate commerce with foreign nations, not to regulate the commerce of foreign nations. Because you can't go to a foreign nation and tell them we're regulating your commerce. And they can't come to the state and regulate the commerce with the state or of the state. It can only regulate its commerce among the states, within the states. So remember, they have jurisdiction, which is power and authority, on the federal lands within the states. So among the several states. So it's within the states, the areas within the states, because that's all they can do. And with the Indian tribes, okay? Not of the federal government. It's not saying to regulate commerce of foreign nations, of the states, and of the Indian tribes, but with and among itself with them. States are not required to be regulated, and the federal government is not required to regulate itself. The federal government is required to regulate itself and its commerce. Now, this was the promise that the states made with each other of the things it was going to do once the states agreed to give some lands to the federal government. That was annexation. To give some lands to the federal government and let the federal government do these things on those federal lands for the benefit of the states in general. Okay, and this is where we see Mr. Cowan asking, what is a legal state government? That's the one they created after the fact, okay? To establish a uniform rule of naturalization on becoming a federal citizen. Okay, that's clause 4. On becoming a federal citizen. Some of the very first laws on naturalization was when the state citizen, this was before a federal citizen was also a state citizen who was not yet a federal citizen, went to the court, the state court, and applied in a court of record to become a federal citizen, and they would move on to the federal lands, and they would be a federal citizen, and they would pay a federal tax because they were living in federal housing and receiving federal benefits and federal privileges, and they had federal rights called the Bill of Rights, and they had an oath, and they were therefore then naturalized. Now, some of these people had children on the federal lands, and so those were citizens of the United States born. And those citizens are mentioned, I believe, in Article 2 as being born or naturalized. The President of the United States can be born or naturalized. Okay, so also then to and uniform laws of the subject of bankruptcies throughout the federal lands. So the federal government has the bankrupt courts of bankruptcies for federal government on federal lands or for the federal people. And I don't think it meant that it would take control of bankruptcies for individual federal citizens on federal lands. I don't think that's what it meant. I think it meant that the federal area could file bankruptcy in a federal court because the federal government has authority over federal government and its places and its people. Okay, to coin money and regulate the value thereof, to fix the weights and measures of the money the federal government will be using among its federal employees, to which it then taxed. Okay, so something on taxation was that in the Bible it says to give to Caesar what is Caesar's. And people think that means that we all have to pay the government. And that's not what it means. Because the history says that Caesar, and it was common that when government had excess land that it wasn't using, it would lend it or sell it or rent it or lease it to poor people who couldn't afford to buy land. And those poor people would agree to produce. So it would produce some crop or some thing, like they would be doing some kind of work, to which then they could sell that and generate money to take care of their families. But as part of the agreement, they would give back to the government a portion of their yield, which was like a rent, and that was the tax. So then when they decided they just weren't going to pay, then the saying is, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, because Caesar gave you something. Now you have to give your share back. You have to pay your rent. Okay, so clause 7 is to establish post offices and post roads. This does not mean off federal lands. They can only do it on federal lands. The federal lands the state gave them. That's where they have power and authority. That is the definition. Post has 4 different meanings. In this, it means the military areas, the federal areas inside the state. So post offices, specific. See this capital P and capital O? But then here is lowercase p and capital R. They didn't do that arbitrarily. This is intentional. This is very intentional. Every letter in this document was scrutinized. Okay, they had a whole committee that went over every single thing before this document was signed, and they wrote it exactly the way they wanted it. It is exact. It is vague to us now when we read it because we don't understand all these things. It's vague because it doesn't say the United States shall be the federal areas. It's vague because it doesn't say post offices shall include messenger services. But the word post also means a station, which is a military station, because that's what this entire section is about, because the federal areas were intended to be for defense with a C purposes. Defense with a C is to fortify. So they need offices for their officers on the federal lands, and they needed roads on the federal lands, and they needed roads in between the federal lands, and in between the federal lands, in between states. So post was sort of a general, any post, where this was specific. Post had specific offices. So at the seat of government, the posts would be like the congressional buildings, the house that the president lives in, because the president's the commander-in-chief, and as being over the military, he's supposed to always be there. That home is supposed to always be occupied, just like the governor's mansions. But the governor's mansions are a state issue, not a federal issue. But on the federal lands, they had houses for their officers and their civilian employees. then they had specific offices. So it wasn't just arbitrarily any office. Certain posts had certain offices, but all posts had roads. And the roads needed to be for specific uses, not for just, just going and just paving everywhere. Okay, so when the government has employees that create things, they want the right to their creations. Federal employees want the rights to their creation. So this is just a natural right that any human being would have, the right to your creation. So when it's saying that we want this right for our federal citizens and for us, they put it in here because they want to tell the states, when you annex those lands, this is what we want to use the lands for. This is what we want to do on the lands. If you buy a property and the property does not convey mineral rights, you don't have rights to those minerals. If the rights are conveyed, it has to be in the contract. Mineral rights are conveyed to the new owner. So this is what this is. This is the same thing. This is what we're going to do on the federal lands when the states give us some of their property or sell us some of their property, or in the case of Texas, rent or lease property to the federal government. It's in the contract. This is all they're going to do. This is what they want. They wanted to be able to build ships, build military equipment, build bigger guns, and they want the rights to those things. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem now is that they're using our money and telling us we have to pay taxes when we don't actually have to pay taxes to it. And it's using that money to create things, and then we have no right to it. So that's wrong. So Clause 9, to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. And then here I've just posted this old case law. And for all you Walking Dead fans, this is Woodbury. Same Woodbury probably. Probably not. But it's funny that Woodbury is also in The Walking Dead, and the person who was in charge of Woodbury was the governor, right? So what does this say? Where the United States own land situated within the limits of particular states, each state individual, that's what particular states mean, and over which they have no cession of jurisdiction for objects either special or general, little doubt exists that the rights and remedies in relation to it are usually the same as applied to the landholders within the state. So what it's saying here is that when the federal government has lands that were not ceded to the federal government, so they own the land, but the jurisdiction wasn't ceded. So the right to making laws over those lands was not given to the federal government. See, it's not a land according to the Constitution where all of these things are allowed on those lands. It's a land. It's a land that they have come in and bought, but the state did not give up the right to make the laws to those lands. Then the rights are the same as a regular landowner. They're no different, because regular landowners have certain rights. And so in this case, where jurisdiction was not ceded, when the lawmaking authority was not given to the federal government, they only have the rights that normal landowners have. Okay? So all of this is all the things that they're allowed to do on the federal land, because it's the agreement to the contract between the state and the federal government as to what powers they have on the federal lands, and they can make the laws that bring these powers into reality. Okay, and then from here it starts being more specific as to military, even though all of this is for defense purposes. Okay, to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. Okay, crimes committed by the officers of the United States Land and Naval Forces, because originally the officers were commissioned, or they were chosen by the state and commissioned by the president. Okay, so the officers were chosen by the state. They became federal citizens, and then the president would commission them. To declare war and grant letters of marque and reprisal and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Okay, that's what the federal government does on their federal lands. To raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be used for a longer term than 2 years. To provide and maintain a navy. To make, this is what they're going to do for us. This is what they're going to do for us. We gave them the land. We give them the people to become federal citizens. And this is what they promised to do for us: to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, not rules and regulations for the government of all the individual people. That's not what it says. It doesn't say that anywhere in here. This is what they can do, and they can do nothing else. Nothing else. There would be a red box around all of this. There should be a red box. That's what they call the four corners. And if you go and you look on the Congress website, whenever they make a amendment to the Constitution, the original document has 2 red lines around it. I may have it here somewhere, a copy. I may not, but you can find it on this website. The documents that are for amendments to the Constitution have 2 red lines all the way around the top, sides, and the bottom. Okay? Meaning it's a 4 corners document. It's confined. They're confined to it. Okay? This is what they're going to do for us on the land we gave them. To provide for calling forth the militia whenever there's something bad going on, whenever we're attacked by an outside force, because that's defense with a C, is fortify, to fortify. To provide for organizing, arming. Okay, I'm going to show you some stuff on the word arm. Arming and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service, specifically a service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers. I just told you that. The states appointed the officers, and the president commissions them, because the president is the commander-in-chief. Okay, and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So the states train the militia according to what the Congress says. Okay, now here's where we get to the meat. To exercise soul-making legislative power. To exercise the legislative power, the lawmaking power, the right to make all the laws aforementioned, all these 1 through 18 are the laws, in all cases whatsoever, over, okay, over what? The federal lands, which is the seat of government and places purchased for forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, So it does all these things. It does all these things so that it can have money to fortify, and it can have the power to fortify. Fortification is according to the laws of nation. It's a good government that fortifies itself. Okay? And it uses the word defense with a C. Defense with an S means something completely different. I've got videos on those if you want to know. And to make, finally, all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers, because they had revenues and the ways in which bills are passed and that kind of thing, also in other parts of the Constitution. So those are the things that it needs to do to carry into execution all these things in Article 1, Section 8, to which the federal government, the Congress, when it passes laws, gives its citation, which is almost always Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8. Lawmaking power. The problem is that everybody claims to be a citizen of the United States, so we claim to be federal citizens and state citizens when we're not, because we're not on federal lands. So if I'm wrong, why does all this make sense? And if I'm right, no one who's not a federal citizen owes a tax or can be regulated by the federal government. Has a constitutional right, because we're outside of it. We have all of our rights. None of us are federal citizens called citizens of the United States unless we're on the federal lands. Cannot be imprisoned by the federal government for any crime committed off federal lands, because they have no jurisdiction off federal lands. They only have the right to summons. They only have the right to summons for crimes off federal lands when they were committed on federal lands. We're not required to get any license, a birth certificate, social security number. And people will say, well, the driver's license says state of Texas. State of Texas is the legal contract between the federal government and the state to give some state rights to federal citizens so that they can use the services. They can be taxpayers, so they can pay for the use of the roads, so they can pay for the schools and the various other things. Okay, so that's what I'm saying here. The state of really should be capital state. The state of whatever state you're in, appearing as an actual state. It appears as an actual state when it's really just a legal state, a state created by Congress, the men in Congress. Remember, I showed you the congressional globe where Mr. Cowan asks the president, what's a legal state? The legal state is the state of that allows federal citizens to become state citizens and state taxpayers according to the 14th Amendment. Okay, so the federal government does not have power over you. It doesn't have jurisdiction over you. It doesn't have the right to tax you. It doesn't have the right to control you. So how do they do it? All of these things at the OLRC website, this is Office of the Law Revision Council, United States Code. All of these that don't have asterisks are not positive laws, and you have to be careful for them because they're slippery little fuckers. Title 23 highways, it shows an asterisk, meaning it has a positive law citation, but when you look through it, there isn't one. Taxes, Internal Revenue Code, it's not a positive law, it's voluntary. Their forms, they're allowed to use their forms as advertisements. Advertisements are also called bills or notices. So they send you something in the mail saying that you owe them something, and it's an advertisement, to which some people write no contract on it and send it back because it's voluntary. I'm not telling you what to do. I don't ever tell people what to do because some people cannot do certain things. And some people are on federal lands and they have to pay federal taxes and they have to pay state taxes and they have to have a driver's license and they have to pay their portion of use of our schools because they're not state taxpayers, which is why Texas has a sales tax. It benefits everyone, and there's no need to distinguish between a federal citizen and a state citizen. But the state citizens are supposed to have a state of Texas license. But that comes from the federal government. That's not something that occurs in the natural state created by the people, the lawful state created by the people. That's coming from the Attorney General and the Secretary of State. So this brings a whole bunch of other things into question. The Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer in the state. It's part of the contract between the federal government and the state to help administer federal citizens' benefits inside the state. But we all claim to be federal citizens. So when you commit a crime off federal lands, they claim to have authority over you, even though they only have authority on federal lands, because it's voluntary. And we give them our name, we give them our social security number, we give them our birth certificate, we go in and we get a driver's license, and we all say that we're part of the federal government and under its control. So as a chief law enforcement officer administering the contracts between the state and the federal government, they claim to have the power over you. But all those things are voluntary. They're voluntary, and their forms are advertisements. And they're required to have an OMB number. The OMB number is the Office of Management and Budget. And all forms are approved, either the ones that are voluntary and the ones that are required for federal citizens. They're mandatory for them and voluntary for everyone else. They were voluntary because not all federal citizens needed the services of the state. Not all federal citizens have children to send to federal schools, so they wouldn't fill out those forms. And each state has its own taxes. So a state would have taxes for itself and its federal citizens that the federal citizens would pay. So that's why you have to go in and fill out a form if you're a federal citizen in the state. But some states honor the driver's license of other states because it all goes back to the federal government. So I hope this is understandable, and I hope you learned from this, and that you are able to understand everything I said, and that you will like and share and subscribe to this channel, and share this video with your friends and your family, because it's going to take a majority, I believe, to change ideas. Once something becomes well known and common knowledge, it can't be denied, and all of this will fall apart because people will start to understand the emperor has no clothes, that the Federal Reserve has no power, that we don't have to use their currency, we don't have to use their paper money, we don't have to have direct deposit. That's for federal employees. We don't have to receive their benefits. We don't have to pay for the benefits other people receive. We don't have to pay federal taxes. We don't have to get licenses with the state of anything. We don't have to register our vehicles. Okay, so this will help us all understand our freedom. We don't have to register our businesses. That's what I was going to say about the Attorney General. Those businesses that register with the Secretary of State are doing so with the legal state created for contract purposes between the federal government and the state to supply services to the people on the federal lands, the federal citizens. So when you register your business, you're saying that you're supplying a service to the federal citizens. And if you're supplying a service to the federal citizens, they want to regulate you because they have to take care of their federal citizens, they think. They feel like they have to watch out for their federal citizens. So they want to regulate businesses that do contracts with their federal citizens or supply services to their federal citizens. And businesses, as far as the federal government's concerned, are called small jurisdictions. Small businesses are small jurisdictions. It's not mom and pop company down the road starting up a coffee shop or a restaurant or a paper store or anything like that. It's not you and me off federal lands. It wants to regulate the people doing business with the federal government, such as the independent school districts, which is a small jurisdiction, which supplies a service to the federal citizens. So in Texas, we have our independent school districts, which may be also allowing federal citizens to attend their schools, to come off the military post and attend their schools. And these are called small jurisdictions, small businesses, which are small jurisdictions according to the federal government, which supply a service to the federal citizens. And so they would be regulated to some extent. But there's just this big money laundering. It's become this big money laundering system. And it's unconstitutional, and we're not required to play in on that. We're not required to pay for that. We're not required to pay for them. We're not federal citizens. We're not on federal lands. We don't get the benefits of having federal housing. We don't get the benefits of being able to go to military medical offices to have free medicine. So we don't have any federal benefits. Now we have Social Security, but that was actually intended also for federal employees. That's what the Social Security number was for their retirement. So much of this stuff is not concerning people who are off federal lands and not federal citizens, including, well, all of this. All their laws, all their regulations, all their codes do not apply to us. There's been a big, huge push in our education system to dumb us down. And I don't know about you, but I went to college at a university, a big university for political science, and I never had to read the Constitution. I was never told that there would be, I was specifically told that there would be no test questions over the United States Constitution. In none of my classes have I ever taken a test that involved any question pertaining to the Constitution of the United States, because then people would start asking questions. What does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? What's an organic law? Why are the Articles of Confederation an organic law? What's a repealing clause? Why aren't the Articles of Confederation actually repealed, but yet they tell us that they're repealed? People would have started asking those questions if they actually had to read the Constitution. But we don't. Nobody's required to read it, as far as I know. So once you understand it, you understand that it's a very strict limitation, and that's probably why they don't want you to read it. But I hope that you all will share this video on Facebook, share the link on Twitter, share it with your friends and your families, email it. I really don't get anything from it other than having people understand so that we can all have our freedom back, and we can all understand that we don't have to sign these papers with the federal government, and we can all be free, sovereign, and independent in our individual capacities. We can keep our money, and things are just going to get worse and worse and worse. And now they're talking about a global tax for corporations, and that's how it's going to start. First, it's going to be for corporations, and then it's going to be for employees. And how are those corporate taxes going to be paid? By the employees, by prices going up. Okay, we need to understand this stuff, and we need to start. I think just understanding it will change things. Knowing is half the battle. Knowing is half the battle, and probably more than half. So, okay, so I'll call it quits. I hope you all have a great day. And again, please share the video, subscribe to it so that I know I'm not just talking to the wind. And please, please, please share.